I'm Michael Krasny, and I welcome you to another episode of Gray Matter with Michael Krasny, a weekly podcast of deep dive interviews with national and international authors, journalists, tech and business experts, artists, scientists, entertainers, and opinion shapers. And you can become a member of this podcast by going to graymatter.show, and that's gray with an E, and you can stream us live at 11 a.m. Pacific time on Fridays when we include your questions and comments. We're going to be covering a wide range of intellectually engaging and timely and stimulating topics, distinguished by high-level content and technical excellence. In this episode, we meet author, documentary filmmaker of The Judge and the General and former chief correspondent with Jim Lehrer of the PBS Newshour, Elizabeth Farnsworth, who served as a reporter and covered crises in Iraq, Iran, Israel, Haiti, Cambodia, Vietnam, Chile, and Botswana. She also published a memoir in 2017 called A Train Through Time. She's a graduate, magna cum laude graduate from Middlebury College with an MA from Stanford, and she's a recipient of the coveted Andrew L. DuPont Columbia Award and a 3-time Emmy nominee. She recently published a novel, which we'll talk about, among other things. It's called Last Light, and it's set in Vienna and Topeka, Vienna in Austria, that is, in Topeka in Kansas, at the time of the Second World War. And I want to welcome Elizabeth Farnsworth to Gray Matter with Michael Krasny.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
And I'm delighted to have you here with us. And I thought, before we talk about your novel and talk about the extraordinary career you've had, I want to talk about some things that are of the moment because, well, you prompted me. You sent me an email and you said, we both have interviewed probably the following people. And you mentioned, first of all, Amos Oz, who you said was very much on your mind. And he's someone who I had the privilege also of interviewing. I guess he's on your mind now because of what's going on in the Middle East.
Well, and because I just read his beautiful, very fat book, A Tale of Love and War, or something like that. I just read it. So he's been on my mind. The book is about how Israel came to the place it is right now, everything that's happening now, even though the book was written quite a while ago. And I remember that when I interviewed him in 2002, a time when Israel was also was really bad times in Israel. And I asked him, you once said that you hoped the tragedy of the relationship between Israel and the Palestinians would be Chekhovian and not a Shakespearean tragedy. What'd you mean? And he said, my definition of a tragedy is a clash between right and right. And in this respect, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has been a tragedy between one very powerful, very convincing, very painful claim over this land and another no less powerful, no less convincing claim. And that this kind of conflict can be resolved in one of two manners. The Shakespearean tradition, the stage hued with dead bodies and justice prevailing, but, everybody's dead, and the Chekhov tradition where at the end everybody's disappointed, disillusioned, embittered, heartbroken, but alive. And he said then that his colleagues were working to have that, not a sentimental happy ending, not brother love, but a Chekhovian ending, which means, I love this, clenched teeth compromise.
Well, there were corpses in Chekhov as well. He was the one who told us if there's a gun in a play, it's going to be used.
I thought about that, actually, when I wrote this and first mentioned the gun.
Well, Oz was, an extraordinary writer and thinker and someone whom I admired a great deal. And he was fighting for some kind of brokered peace for a Palestinian state that could exist. You get into that whole argument about can it exist in peace, because the argument goes immediately to Gaza. And, who would have believed that hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars would have gone just into building tunnels and buying weaponry and so forth. I mean, they were talking initially about turning Gaza into a kind of great recreational place for, the sheikhs and the wealthy and so forth. But he had a kind of insight and wisdom that was really quite rare. And I think we were both very fortunate in having had the opportunity to talk to him. Of course, you've had the opportunity to talk to people. I was supposed to interview Henry Kissinger, but never did. Some people said that was probably maybe his good fortune, because I might have said, what about the war criminal charges of Christopher Hitchens against you? But you also interviewed Bibi Netanyahu, and I never had that experience. And
neither was easy. They both have the great gift of talking over you. At least with Kissinger, I was in the same room with him.
Is that a gift?
Well, the gift that, from my point of view, it's a gift that gives them a certain power when they keep talking and don't let you talk. It works for them because they get more time in the interview. But Netanyahu was down the line where I was in a studio one place and he was in a studio the other. That was hard because certain people just know that if they keep talking, you'll only get one or two questions in. And if you're there, you can make faces or do something. But if you're down the line, you really can't. And so interviewing Netanyahu, he was extremely defensive in the interview about a status that talks were in then. And he talked all the time. Kissinger talked to me. He's a very interesting person to interview.
You said he was a bully.
He was. I decided that bully's not quite the right word. I was talking to him about a release of declassified documents in 2001.
You mean the kind of documents that are now in Mar-a-Lago, or before they became declassified?
These are all declassified U.S. documents that the Clinton administration had released because Pinochet had been arrested in London, and they wanted the evidence that that the government had, that the U.S. knew that he was killing people from the very beginning, and et cetera, et cetera. So Kissinger agreed to be interviewed about the documents. And what's interesting in what he does is I know from other journalists, this was his modus operandi. He has you come in and he says, I know you're fair. I know you won't do me in. I know the NewsHour's fair. I'm really counting on you. There are legal issues involved here because these were documents that pointed out that he and Nixon and the rest of the leadership of that government were determined to get rid of Salvador Allende, overthrow him. And he says all that, and then you have the interview, and then he calls. We were in the cab, my producer and me, and then he calls and says, I'm counting on you. You're not a bad person. I know the NewsHour's fair. Well, naturally, we would have been fair. Whether he had done that at all, the NewsHour was careful about that kind of thing. But also, I wasn't going to cut anything because of anything he said. And actually, it was a very interesting interview because I said, you met with Pinochet face to face in 1976. He was then charged with a whole slew of crimes, 57 murders and 18 kidnappings. And one of the things that the doc shows is that you brought up human rights very briefly with him, but you also said, we're behind you. We're sympathetic with what you're trying to do. I think the previous government was headed toward communism. I think you're a victim of the left-wing groups around the world. Why did you not say to him, you're violating human rights, you're killing people, stop it? And Kissinger said, international human rights were not an issue at the time in the way they've become since. That was not what diplomats and secretaries of state and presidents were saying then. So it was a very interesting interview. He also gave a pretty good critique of why the documents could be misused, etc. I mean, he had things to say that were interesting too.
He was the epitome of realpolitik, and that's really what he was all about. But he did some really dreadful things. And East Timor is another example, along with Chile and many that come to mind, of just think about what went on in Southeast Asia. You were there, and the bombing that was unnecessary but was done to essentially try to get them to acquiesce. I mean, you've been in so many situations and had the opportunity to interview so many luminary people, both good and evil, or both, a combination of the two. Let me ask you about interviewing, though, especially since I'm actually writing a book about interviewing and conversation, and a lot of things challenge me. Was Jim Lehrer was kind of a mentor to you?
Yes, he was. Jim was both a friend and a mentor. I feel like I owe everything to Jim and Robin McNeill.
And now you're writing novels. Like he used to say to me, I have the fever. I have to write a novel.
Yeah, and I have the same fever. He was a mentor, and he would say, first of all, short questions, always. He would say, you don't want the person that's hearing the interview to be thinking and thinking about you. You want them always to be thinking about the person that's being interviewed by you. If they at the end talk about you, you've made a mistake somewhere. It was amazing all the things he taught us, and Robin too. And Robin was really tough. It wasn't strictly speaking deported, but we got taken out at gunpoint from Haiti at one point.
This is the Duvalier years?
This was when they were trying to put back in, the Anyway, it was a time when the U.S. It was during the Clinton administration, and we were kicked out. And when I got back, it was filmed. All the press that were there filmed them taking us with the guns in this back of a truck, and we hadn't done much of anything. That's a whole other story. But Robin interviewed me down the line afterwards. I was here at KQED, and he was in Washington D.C. then. This is before I was a sub anchor. And he was tough. You were picked up because you were on the tarmac at the airport and it wasn't allowed. Why'd you do it? I mean, it was a great interview and I could answer all of this, but I realized that's what it means to be a really good interviewer. It doesn't matter how much we like each other. You and I would have to ask the tough questions to each other.
Well, that's what made them...
You're a very good interviewer, by the way.
Well, thank you. But I come from a little bit of a different school. Laird was an influence on me and used to say to me, you should be invisible. The questions that come from you should be tough, but the focus is obviously on the person you're interviewing. And I found I wanted sometimes, maybe it's because I was an educator for many years, I wanted to bring in my own thoughts, my own reactions or observations, feelings even. And so I've kind of, in my mind, set up a kind of spectrum almost. On one end, you had Jim Lehrer, who, by the way, I suppose you know this, didn't want to be identified even with any political party. He would not even register, which
right.
I thought...
And by the way, you know he's a Kansan, as am I.
Yes.
That's one reason we were very close, but go ahead.
We're going to talk about Kansas because your novel is set there, as I say. But maybe the only novel extant set in both Topeka and Vienna. But I said to Jim Lehrer, because I heard him once talking about Bosnia, and he got kind of exercised, and he was challenging somebody who was, I think, maybe defending the then government because they were committing genocide. And I said, well, you can really kind of, he said, that's the only time, Michael, the only time that I let my feelings go and so forth, and I felt badly about it. But there is a kind of spectrum. There are some interviewers who are, I think, really good interviewers who are almost all, this is how I see things and this is how I mean, Chris Matthews is a good example. I used to say, even though he was a devout Catholic, if he interviewed the Pope, he'd be interrupting him at every instance. But he's good, and he has a lot of information, a lot of things to bring to the fore. And then there's the Jim Lehrer on the other end. That was what public radio's ideal was, and you were very much a part of it. You were integral to it, and certainly distinguished yourself, to put it mildly. And you also went out there and covered those tough stories.
I was lucky to get to do both. I mean, I did the stories a lot and then was asked to be a sub-anchor for Jim when he was gone and to be chief correspondent. So I got to do both, and I did stay as in Washington. I moved part-time to Washington. My husband and I sort of went back and forth. But and I very much liked anchoring. I feel so grateful I got to do it. The people at the NewsHour, I just admired the people I got to work with, Mike Massetti and Linda Winslow and Les Crystal and all these people so much. But I did miss being in the field. And the being in the field in Haiti and being deported had kind of put the fear of
trauma
of that in me, yeah, because I worried much worse than us being kicked out was that our fixer and our driver were temporarily in prison, and we worked like crazy and got them out, and everything turned out okay, but I just didn't want to do that again. And then eventually I did go back to being in the field, and again, not that it happened with us, but our fixer in Iraq, while he was working with the Times, was killed. And the crew and I really loved this person. So after that, I thought, that was 2003, and I did go to I went to Israel after that and Iran, but I thought no more. And I realized that when you work with people in the field, you have to be willing to take the chance that they might, just like you might get hurt. Not that I was in open combat or anything, but we were places where one could be hurt. And you have to think that could happen to them, but I couldn't have stood that, I don't think. If a cameraman and sound man, they don't have any way of seeing what's happening around them, really. They've got their earphones on and they're with their eye in the camera.
You're very vulnerable.
Yeah, and if anything had happened to them, I don't think I could have stood it. So I haven't done anything like that since maybe 2005. That's one reason I'm writing books. I wrote the memoir and then wrote this book.
So I've got to ask you, what do you think about news coverage today, and not only in public broadcasting, but just the kind of coverage that is 24 hours, looking for breaking stories, looking for news that they can manufacture sometimes?
Yeah. I'm afraid that I can tell from the question that I probably agree with you. I think the 24-hour news cycle is not great for the news. And I think the NewsHour, by the way, is doing a great job. I really like the anchors. I think the producer, Sarah Just, is doing a good job. And sometimes the news on the other channels is very, very good too. But I think the 24-hour news cycle is not good for us.
There's still a big break between commercial news coverage and commercial broadcasting and TV and radio and public broadcasting. And it's not to put the hagiographic halo around public broadcasting, but there's less concern with being first to the story, first of all. And there's less concern with being kind of tabloid and sensational, which is what news coverage has turned into in commercial broadcasting.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, it was interesting in morning meetings for me to watch. Robin had, of course, been with BBC. He'd worked with NBC, I think. And Jim had so much experience in Texas and then in Washington. And I'd watch as the big stories that we might cover that night would be considered. And they were brilliant in the way they sorted out the ones that were really important and the ones that we had to wait to see how important they became.
It was great curating.
Brilliant. I'm sure that you curated. You were doing that all the time too, and it's such an art. It's not an art. I don't think I have that art. But boy, did Robin and Jim, and also Will S. Crystal and Linda Winslow, the producers then, and Sarah Just now. The producers make a lot, as you know, a lot of the decisions in television.
Yeah, and certainly are not as celebrated or given the those of us who sat in front of the microphone got the main limelight or spotlight. How did you get into this career? I mean, you were a Latin American Studies graduate. That was your background, collegiate?
Latin American history. Got a master's in Latin American history at Stanford. And I wrote a thesis. Middlebury didn't have Latin American history, but I went to Peru.
What was the thesis?
My thesis at Stanford was about a president of Peru in the 1900s. But at Middlebury, one summer my uncle set up, he had friends in Trujillo, Peru, and if I would take his son, who was younger than my cousin, who was younger than I was, he'd arrange with the person he was working with in this business for us both to be there. And I worked in a clinic. I worked in a clinic left in a slum by the Hope Ship. The person I was living with was translating in that clinic, and I just cleaned up, and I was 19 years old. But I saw things. This was a place where almost all the babies that came in had just horrible scabs on their heads because there was no water to wash them with. We were stopped one day because somebody had a self-inflicted abortion because she couldn't feed her children. How could she have another child? So I just decided I'd be interested in Latin America and U.S. policy. So I was, and then I ended up going to Chile and working on a film, and that led to me I wrote my first story after that for a small newspaper, and I can't even remember which one it was. It was one of the newspapers that we had in the early 70s in San Francisco.
That you were reporting.
And then I started reporting.
Well, let me jump ahead here because I want to talk with you about your novel, which is well worth reading and where you capture a whole period in American history that's always been fascinating to me and I think will be to other readers right around the wartime. Let's talk about what those of us who are literary scholars call the dene, the given. The given is that POWs are coming from North Africa, especially from Tunisia, German POWs, and they're going to hospitals, in this case in Topeka, which is your home grounds, joking with you about being like Dorothy leaving Kansas, and you probably never leave it. I mean, you've gone back to it in this novel and gone back to Buffalo Ridge and all these places that are clearly familiar to you and bringing them back alive for readers. The setting is really quite compelling. But here we are with these German POWs, and there's a kind of mysterious suspense to this story. I'm not giving you a review. I'm just sort of setting things up here. But who is this guy who's supposedly of lower rank? He seems to be much more in the know and much more of a higher rank, much more, in fact, he turns out, I don't want to give away anything but it turns out to be a major in the Luftwaffe. And there are reasons behind that, and that's part of what grabs you as a reader. I don't think I'm giving away too much here.
Please don't.
But what you do is you establish a kind of recognition that these are German POWs who are being taken care of whereas the hospitals are segregated and the African Americans are not being taken care of. And so right away, we're back in that crazy time warp of racism, and you highlight it, you make it palpable.
Well, and the main character, Isabel Graham, who becomes an interpreter at the this is an imaginary hospital that I invented. Topeka did have a U.S. military hospital, U.S. Army hospital.
But that was historically true. I mean,
it was true that POWs came, and the first ones came to Topeka from the battles of North Africa, especially Tunisia. And it's true that there were many camps in Kansas. There were camps here too, many POW camps. But the most ill prisoners were treated at the Army hospital, and black soldiers weren't. There was a hospital in the South for black soldiers, but it's true. And he was actually Austrian. He pretended to be. He had amnesia. The main character, who eventually turns out to be what he wasn't, and who this young woman who's an interpreter has to, in a way, become a spy to figure out who the heck he is and why is he pretending to be somebody he isn't. He points out that Hitler admired the segregation policies of the United States and spoke about it. And he points it out to her. But as my family was, her family were abolitionists. They'd come to Kansas during Bleeding Kansas. They were all abolitionists on her mother's side.
And you give a very
and they're fairly well known in Kansas.
Good picture of that abolition history and the Presbyterian history and the service that brought to mind, which is why Isabel goes to become an interpreter.
So her mother's already in a group that is trying to desegregate at least the hospitals. Her father's a doctor in a segregated hospital. So all that's happening at the same time as she's trying to help the Americans. She's been trained to help the Americans as a nurse's aide. And she's trying to interpret for this very interesting guy who she knows right away is Austrian, because the book starts, she spent a year in Austria and had a particular gift for language and had a tutor who she adored. And so that's a very important part of this. She figures out, of course, that this soldier is actually Austrian because she recognizes the accent.
Well, he also hears her Austrian
right
accent.
Away, yeah. He says, I think you must have lived in Austria.
And the tutor, whose name is Otto, turns out, disappear. And it's very disturbing to her, not only because she's clearly infatuated with him, but the fact of the matter is she's a really remarkable character in many ways. I really admired Isabel because she wants to get at truth. She's kind of a crusader, really, to try to get at the truth.
Yeah, when he disappears and she can't find out why, her parents don't tell her. It's particularly, I don't want to give any of it away, it's a particularly upsetting and bloody situation. And they just don't want her to know what happened. And they're not, you get to know them well enough to know that it may not have been the right decision, but many of us have made wrong decisions as parents. And they thought they were protecting her. But she had trauma, and the trauma was not made manifest because she couldn't figure out what had happened and what she should be thinking about it. And so here she is. She has this Austrian who's in her mind constantly. She was 13 when that happened. And now she's 23 or 4, and she's helping this person who's clearly Austrian. And what is she to think of him? And, of course, there's this fairy tale that runs all the way through it, too, which is the juniper tree. And the juniper tree is basically about vengeance. Did she want to somehow have vengeance for what happened to Otto? Somewhere in her mind, she knew what had happened, but she just couldn't face it. Or did she not? And that really is what she's faced with in the novel.
And there's an Alice Hoffman quote that I really like about fairy tales and how they can be pretty bloody. Boy, think about Grimm, but a lot of them, when you strip them away or deconstruct them, you realize just how violent they can be. And she, unfortunately, goes through some violence, which I'm not going to give anything away on, but there's more amnesia. There's a couple of cases of amnesia and so forth. I mean, you think about war writers and writers who take us into some of the trauma of war. Of course, Hemingway comes to mind immediately, but also Stephen Crane. I'm thinking about American writers. There are many more on the continent. Were you influenced by some of these writers?
Well, I think I was very influenced by being in Germany and Austria and by observing what you can observe of the war and of what happened to the Jews in both countries. And And my father was in the Navy. He was a person that taught people flying airplanes and the people in the airplanes how to shoot. And that's what he did at various naval air stations. My uncle was in combat in the Army. And so I was born in 1943. And so by 46 or 47, already I was beginning to be old enough to be hearing about war and war stories and all of that. I think all of us, you're a little bit younger than I am, but I think all of us that lived in the time of World War II, even if we were very young, were hugely influenced by it. And later, of course, I came to know that there were POWs, lots of them in Kansas. One came back to Salina, Kansas, where my sister lived, because he liked it so much. They built the beautiful little chapel on the University of Kansas where many people are born, stonemasons. So all of this was part of my life. But the book is really about this young woman, and she's based on, actually, I should tell you how she came to me. I was sitting just like we're sitting, and instead of looking at you, I was just kind of looking up at my book's shelf while I was thinking, and I was writing something, and she appeared, this young woman appeared with a ponytail on a horse, and she was looking through a barbed wire fence at a man in a small one-story building, and he was looking through barred windows. And they were looking at each other, and I knew they were in the prairie. And I'm a prairiephile. I love the prairie in Kansas and loved it as a child. And so I realized right away, okay, this is the story I meant to tell. She is not me. This has got to be war. Why would they be looking through barbed wire and barred windows? But what was it? So that's when I went to I went back to Topeka, went to the Kansas Historical Society, and did all the research on the POWs. That's how it happened.
It's fascinating how an image like that can take hold of you. I mean, I think about Faulkner seeing in his mind a young girl trying to get out on a pear tree from a window with soiled underpants. That's the Sound and the Fury. I mean, you can just take that image and suddenly you have a whole story.
Well, I think that that's the way it works. I have an image that I've been seeing now that I might write about. That's the way for at least my creative process works. And I grew up with a sick mother. My mother died when I was young. She was ill, and I was raised by aunts, and one of my cousins and also my sister were what we called tomboys in those days. Totally brave, ride a horse anywhere. We weren't rich. These were not fancy horses. We're talking about a pig farm where we kept our horse. And we would, I didn't think of it as the prairie. I thought of it as the area just beyond where my cousin lived, that we could go down and have campfires and I mean, I'm 7 or 8. She's 9 or 10. And we can lie down and just look at all the animals and see the eagles come by. But I was in the prairie. I was just on the edge of Topeka in the prairie. And so I decided, and I later have become a prairiephile. Terry Evans did the beautiful picture on the book, and she's a great prairie photographer and is a close friend of mine. But I feel so lucky that I relived that in creating these two young cousins that are so brave in their love of the prairie and what they do on the prairie. And of course, that's why Isabel could do what she did later when she had to face true danger with the POWs.
And these cousins love each other and are very devoted. I mean, it really comes across quite well. Plus, you dedicated this book to your sister? You mentioned your sister
Yes, my
before.
sister died 2 years ago, and she had a horse named Flag, and Joe, the horse, is very much based on Flag. And she kept her horse at the pig farm, and my cousin had her horse Penny at the pig farm too. And of course, I rode them, but I was too little to ride Flag. Flag was very spirited. And Penny I could ride, but I was still, the cousin was 2 years older, and Marcia, my sister, was 6 years older. So I didn't get to ride as much then as I did some later.
So you became sort of an equestrian?
No, I never did, and this is all Western saddle.
Oh.
I never, my sister became quite serious as a Western saddle horse rider.
But the horses play
Salina.
a central role in your narrative.
I'm a horse lover. I'm kind of mad for horses. I wished on a star for maybe 3 years every night to give me a horse, but my sister got it and I didn't.
I have images in my mind from reading your novel, women on horseback, and particularly Isabel on a horse. And I didn't think of her with a ponytail, but now I do. Thank you for that. But she's an intrepid and certainly a very strong-willed and admirable young woman. And I think it's important for you as a novelist, I assume, to create that kind of a character.
Well, and I also wanted her to really come up against it. And what happened in the camps in Kansas and elsewhere during the time of POWs is that those that had been fanatical about Hitler, Nazis, but even not only Nazis, this was part of the German military training. If you thought somebody was going to become a stool pigeon and give away secrets, you could kill them. And I haven't been able to find out for sure if it's in German law, but I think it is. At the end of the book, there's a lot. There are
certainly in the Nazi ethos.
Yeah, and I cited sources for how to look for this. And of course, nobody in Kansas in the hospital, the Army hospital, nothing terrible like that ever happened. It happened in the camps. And it did happen. People were killed in the camps. But I have this very bad thing happen in the hospital. And I needed Isabel to be brave enough to handle this. She had to be able to shoot. I write in my acknowledgments or at the end, I write that my parents gave my sister a .22 rifle and a horse when she was 13. And so we could all shoot. Nobody ever thought about shooting anybody. My dad hunted a little bit. He didn't even like killing animals.
No school shootings in those days.
No school shootings. But I wanted to have this come to a real head and to have her have to make decisions about shooting. And that's because I always wondered if I could protect those people with me if I were in the field and had a gun. I still don't know the answer to that.
Well, I can understand that. In fact, I remember at one point there's danger in reading certain writers. I was reading Jerzy Kosinski, and I thought, if I had to, could I kill somebody? And there was a groundhog that was coming up on our front lawn, and I thought, maybe this is a way to determine, because I couldn't get rid of it. I was trying to use water and all kinds of things. And determinedly, I was a young man, and I'm an animal lover, but I'm a carnivore too, so there's not necessarily a deep hypocrisy in this. I decided, can I kill this groundhog? And I did kill the groundhog, Sometimes you have to kind of realize that survival requires that kind of mettle in you. And she has a lot of mettle. She's got a strong spine, and you bring this character forward in ways. I'm sure you identified with her, even though you didn't see her as necessarily an autobiographical projection. She was clearly dear and important to you.
She was much more my cousin than me, but yes, and I love that.
But also
cousin.
Your alter ego, maybe.
Yeah, maybe my alter ego. Yeah.
And you get your readers to really admire her, and that's no small talent. How does this kind of writing, I'll get back to the novel in a moment, but differ from, I also talked to you about the memoir you wrote, very different kind of writing. I'm struggling now with stories about J.D. Vance, for example, who I interviewed about Hillbilly Elegy, and I thought, a lot of this reads like fiction, and you can write a fictional story, and sometimes stuff about your cousin or autobiography gets in there, and it becomes almost quasi-autobiographical. And you can write. There was a guy, in fact, named James Fry. You might remember 1,000 Little Pieces, and he was exposed as a total fraud. He said this was memoir, and it wasn't. It was a novel. It was completely made up out of whole cloth. He was exposed by some online site. So I'm always kind of, in my own mind, mediating and trying to meditate between what is autobiographical and what's fictional. Now, this is fiction. You wrote a novel.
Yes. The memoir is part fiction, but part, and I make it clear in the afterword, was part reporting from places I'd worked. And then I intermingled it with fiction, which, maybe you shouldn't do, but I did it.
Well, you have license to do that. Tell me about the difference, though, in terms of craft for you in writing a memoir as opposed to writing a novel.
The part of the memoir that was reporting, of course, was easier because I'm used to reporting. I'm used to having to sit down and write quickly. I also worked in radio, if you remember Internews in the 70s. And we had to write our stories within 2 hours. We decided at 1 or something we had to feed them to KSAN and all these places by 3. So I can write fairly quickly if I'm reporting. I made that reporting much prettier than most of my reporting would be. But the fiction, I submitted stories to 17 when I was 15 or 16, 17 magazine. So I've really always tried to write fiction. Those were fiction stories. And I can write fiction fairly quickly too. But of course, I can tell you, and I'm sure you will not disagree with me, this book is not a great novel. I'm not a great novelist. I hope it's a good story and people want to read it.
But it's a good story, yes, and that's what matters. Plus, it's a kind of a complicated plot in many respects, which is not easy to do.
Well, it means a lot to me that you like it, but you and I both know that great novelists are really different from mediocre, or even, not even as good as mediocre
Elizabeth,
novelists.
I learned years ago as a would-be aspiring novelist, I wasn't good enough and I wasn't bad enough. I mean, good enough to be, sort of like Thomas Mann or James Joyce or writer Faulkner. I could never be in that category, Bellow. But, I couldn't write schlock either. There's a certain ability.
You needed Brenda Hillman to advise you. Do you know Brenda?
I know Brenda, and I'm an admirer. And
she's helped me so much. She just has this one word, fragments. Do it in short bits. And it helps a lot. So if you get a chance to do that, take that advice.
Well, she's a poet, though.
Yeah, she's a poet. It's true.
And also married to Bob Haas, who is poet laureate, and they're both some sort of friends of mine. I think the problem with fragments, I don't want to get in the weeds here, but, as a composition teacher for many years, I'd have students who would turn in fragments and they'd say, hey, Hemingway writes in fragments. I say, yeah, but he's Hemingway.
It's Hemingway,
you have
right.
to kind of
That's
communicate
true.
that.
That's a good point.
How much is prose style a part of how important is it to you, say, when writing fiction or nonfiction?
It's very important. And by the way, I want to say, the publisher of this book is named Thea Rademacher, and she has a small publishing house in Kansas. I think she really helped me a lot with this, too. I want to mention her. And Amy Rennert, I want to mention your friend, who is my agent, has helped me a lot. Many people help me. I want every sentence to be really fine, and I don't always succeed would be the way I'd answer that question. Really fine, and I don't always succeed.
We have that in common. Last Light, let's talk about the title, because it's significant, and we talk about lightness and darkness. You do in rather somewhat poetic language, but also recognizing that life brings both. Why the last light?
I was not prepared for that question, but somebody did ask me that question in a reading at Mrs. Dalloway's in Berkeley, and I thought about it since. I think that the light on the prairie is so omnipresent. The part of the prairie that I'm writing about is not exactly where Topeka is. It's just a little tiny bit to the west. It's called the Flint Hills, and it's some of the last unbroken prairie in the country, really in the world, and a very large amount of prairie that's unbroken because there's a lot of limestone and stuff, so you can't really till some of it. And that's because it was an ancient sea. But the light is omnipresent and beautiful, and you're in it, and there's just this enormous sky over you. So light was a big part of my life growing up, the looking at the sunsets, looking at the sunrises. And also, the book is timeless in a way, even though it's set in that period. For me, it's also about the period I grew up, about these people that I knew. So light and time are very much related, as physicists would tell us. I can't explain why. But I know that I was thinking about time and light all at the same time. And then remember that Vienna at that time had already gotten electric lights, but some of Vienna, just like a whole lot of other places in Europe, still had the gas lights. And I don't know if you've ever been around gas lights, but they're very... They're romantic in a way, but they can also be spooky.
We talk about people being gaslighted.
Right, yeah. And she sees the gaslight out of her window in Vienna a lot, and things happen about that. And so I guess light just became terrifically important. And her cousin, for reasons I don't know, this was not my cousin, in college she studied light and physics. She ends up doing something else, but she was a genius, that particular cousin. And so that's why I guess I called it Last Light. It opens with first light. She and her cousin are in the prairie watching the sun come up, not opening, but early in the book. And it ends as she goes to say goodbye to where the hospital used to be. That hospital was totally invented by me in the Flint Hills. And it's been knocked down to build the real one in Topeka now. But she goes to see that, and it's Last Light.
Well, the prairie is so central to your imagination here, to your memory, to your heart and mind. I can't help thinking about the old lyric. It's a song. I won't attempt to sing it. Oh, bury me on the old prairie. You want to be buried on the prairie?
Well, my husband and I have talked about that. My family is all in a beautiful cemetery that is it's in Topeka, but it's a hill, it's prairie. And I don't think I think we want to be buried together. So I don't think he also, by the way, lived in Topeka, but I think he wants to be buried somewhere here closer to our children so they can visit us.
You see, I'm also thinking about The Wizard of Oz for some reason. It's not Kansas anymore. You're creating a world here that is Kansas, but it's not Kansas. And here you are living in Berkeley, which is certainly not Kansas by any stretch of the imagination. And yet there's that sense of a longing for home. And maybe it's one of the reasons why The Wizard of Oz is such a classic. I mean, you're talking about the prairie in ways that just embrace the longing.
Yes. And thank you for that you noticed that. Don't we all long for home in some ways? I mean, even people that didn't have...
But Thomas Wolfe said you can't go home again, and he was right. One of the few things he was right about.
Yeah. But I think we live... I want to read this Wendell Berry quote that very much appeals to me. He said, "The power of imagination is to see things in their eternal aspect. It is to know the timeless as it moves through time, the eternal presence that is both in and outside of time, and that comprehends the things we know and remember." And somehow I loved writing this book because I was going back in my imagination and, gathering all those memories and bringing them into the now. It's not that I cry to be in the past or miss the past, or I have a very lovely present, but I do think that most of us live very much, and the older we are, the more it happens, very much still thinking about the past.
Well, there's another past that comes across in your novel. You mentioned earlier the abolition movement, which plays certainly a minor but nevertheless significant role. And you even go into the Underground Railroad.
Yes, and all of this was important. I mean, Topeka was always on our minds because by the time I'm in 4th or 5th grade, my best friend is the daughter of the head of the school board that was trying to get the schools integrated. Her name was Linda Dickinson, and her father was Jacob Dickinson. And he's one of the people that, along with the black lawyers and the various people that made this all happen. And the very first 2 people to integrate a class, I think I've learned there was one other school. I thought at first it was just my grade school. But Linda Dickinson's in my 5th grade class had 2 black girls in it, and those were the first black girls to integrate the schools in Topeka. The schools had been integrated in the past, and it's a whole long story about Kansas, but very much a part of my life. And I knew my parents, thank heavens, did support that, but not everybody in the family did.
We also bring John Brown to our attention.
Yeah, John Brown. I mean, the bloody. I have records. I have a memoir where they were like memos written by this would be my great-great-great-grandmother. And they were all writing with people either like John Brown or not like John Brown, because the Missourians were coming over and attacking, and they had to defend against that. And I don't know that anybody rode with John Brown, but I wouldn't be surprised if they didn't. I don't think they would have been with him when he killed all those people, because I think the historians know who was with him.
But you grapple through a young girl's mind with the whole question of, should you be able to kill for higher principles? Or, if somebody is a slave owner, do they deserve to die? And
yes, and she asked the minister about that.
Yeah.
And he says nobody should ever make an example of John Brown. But he does accept, because the Presbyterian Church at that time believed that God can turn evil to good. And he had decided that John Brown had in some way turned evil to good, because we did have the end of...
The Presbyterian Church was really, in some ways, I don't know if I would say responsible, though, for so much of the behavior that went on at this time. Not only in terms of what I alluded to before about Isabel feeling she wanted to be in service in some way, but just the idea of the ethos of how to live your life.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. And
it was transgenerational, wasn't it?
It was, I think. It was. And the Congregational Church, which we went to later because my mother died and we moved closer to the Congregational Church when my father remarried, but was quite similar. My parents used to say they're Republicans, and, why are you a Democrat? Why have you turned this direction you've turned? And I said, you sent me to church.
Are you still proud to be a Kansan?
Yeah, I am.
You root for the Chiefs?
No, I'm not for the Chiefs. I'm a 49er fan, but I watch those games very closely. I still have many relatives in Kansas. I've gone back a lot over the years. My parents lived there. My stepmother and my father have died, but I went back a lot. My sister lived in Salina, and I went back, 3 or 4 times a year, anytime I could, to see her. I love being in Kansas. I just love it.
I associate Robert Dole with Kansas almost irretrievably, and the things that he would say about his boyhood and so forth. I mean, they're filled with nostalgia, and you're filled with nostalgia.
It's true. It's true. And, of course, remember Ike, thinking of World War II. Ike grew up in Abilene. Awful lot of Kansans had to do with the war. But it's hard to take yourself seriously when you live in a place that a tornado or just some huge storm, or it's so hot or it's so cold. It's so overwhelming, the prairie and the weather and everything about it. I remember growing up, and this I think is still true as far as I know, though I haven't been living there. People don't take themselves so seriously. They don't talk about, you ask somebody what they do, they're not going to brag about it. It's just a kind of a wonderful place in that way.
And there's real beauty there, too.
Yeah, real beauty.
You've settled in California now for how many years?
My husband and I came to Stanford, and then we lived in Peru for a year, and then I've lived in California. I've lived in El Centro. My husband was with California Rural Legal Assistance.
You live in D.C., too?
I lived in D.C. for a while, but my husband and I have lived in El Centro, in Delano. He was with the Farm Workers Union, and then Mill Valley, and then Berkeley. And we've been in the Bay Area since 1970.
I'm often asked this question. I'll ask it of you. How much do you miss being in the limelight?
Not at all. Not at all. Not at all. I mean, with the kind
3 times. Yeah, I believe you.
I loved everything about it, and I love everything about my life now, too. How about you?
I miss it sometimes. You know what I miss? I miss breaking news. I really, enjoyed getting on top of a story.
Yes, that's true.
The challenge of it and so forth. And also, I mean, I'm doing interviewing, but it's just once a week. And, every day, it's funny, these Facebook things come and say, here's something you posted 15 years ago. And, it's a reminder of, a guest of some august quality that I managed to, that they managed to book for me and so forth. And I mean, you and I were right in the center of things, of what was going on and being able to tell stories.
We were really lucky.
Very fortunate.
Really fortunate. And I think we're lucky in a way to have stepped out of it when we did. But it is hard not sometimes to think, well, I'm a nobody now. It's the way it is. I think it's just fine.
Plus, it's, things have gone over to different kinds of extremes. I'll leave it at that.
It's part of just the whole thing about aging and growing up and adjusting. We know this. If we were lucky, our parents helped us do it because they had to adjust to all the changes in their lives. So that's what I accept it as. And I feel so fortunate, love everything. I'm so grateful to the NewsHour people that I worked with. But I'm just as happy to be gone.
Well, I remember Jim Lehrer once, I was in conversation with him, and he spoke about you in ways that sort of remind me now of the way Biden talks about Kamala Harris, with a sense of pride and isn't she terrific and all of that's the kind of thing.
He's just such a good friend.
Yeah, but it was, clear that he was an important figure in your life and you were an important figure in his, and he was a good mentor to you.
Do you know that Jim, for vacations occasionally, would fly to Kansas, rent a car, and then go drive around in the area that I'm writing about here for 2 or 3 days just by himself. That was one of his ideas of fun. And I wanted to say about interviewing people. You've interviewed Jim, and did he cry with you? Jim was an easy cry.
I never saw him cry, no.
I interviewed him at the Jewish Community Center here in San Francisco. And we talked about, Jim was a fanatical collector of bus items. He had a bus. He had a big bus and loved buses. And it's because his father had gone bankrupt with a small bus company in Marion, Kansas, Wichita and Marion, Kansas. And we talked about what it meant for his father. I mean, think of Jim was probably, he was about 10 or 15 years old, 10 years older than I was. So this is a long time ago. And we started to talk about that bankruptcy and what it meant for him and his father. And he wept on the stage. And that's just the way he was. He was so open with his feelings and such a kind person in so many ways and so demanding in many ways, too. He was a very kindly, demanding
he was tough in some way.
Yeah.
But I have respect and admiration for that. It took me a long time to feel, because crying for boys was thought to be sissy. You kept your
Yeah,
I
unfortunately.
remember, in fact, I've written a little bit about this. One Halloween where there was a girl named Cheryl who, I don't know if I fancied her or whatever, but I was trying to scare her Halloween stuff. I had eggs and I pretended like I was going to throw them at her. And she closed the window, shut the window. It was like a reflex right on my fingers. And I was standing there. The fingers were really mangled. They called an ambulance. It may have been over the top, but nevertheless, I was in a lot of pain. And I thought, you cannot let a tear be shed. You cannot show that. That's sissy. That's not the way boys, men, are supposed to behave. And you knew about some of the experiences I had with a sixth grade teacher who believed in corporal punishment and exercised it on me. Again, never show tears. I respect that because now at this stage of life, now I can show them and I don't feel that I'm usurping my masculinity or my testosterone in any way.
Are you enjoying doing the podcast? Does it fill a lot of the same role as the work did before in the radio?
So you're still an interviewer. I enjoy it, and I can't. What can I say? I mean, I do it because I enjoy it. I've never, and this is part of the good fortune of the way things have turned out in my life. But I've never done anything without feeling I was enjoying it, whether it was writing or lecturing or interviewing. Those are all things I enjoyed. I had a taste and you may have too, as a boy and as a young man, of a lot of hard work. And I'm not saying that it didn't give a certain pleasure, because it could. But I had a father who worked like a dog, and I had a brother who worked like a dog, and I wanted to use what cerebrality I had and make a life and vocationally more invested in ideas and journalism and the life of the mind, really.
Well, you succeeded greatly. And the podcast, you've got so many good people coming. I was honored when I was asked to come. Well,
we're honored to have you, and it's been a joy to do in so many ways. It's also challenging because, and you know this as well from your experiences, when you're working for, whether it's PBS or KQED, you've got a whole organization behind you. It's not only the producers. I've got a wonderful team here. I give them credit after every podcast, deservedly so. But you've got, for example, a marketing team, and you've got a PR team, and you've got all these inroads to partnerships and all the rest of that. This is a kind of fledgling, small operation, and I don't know. I mean, people like Rogan have made enormous successes of themselves. And one of the things about the book I'm writing now, it's allowed me an opportunity to speculate about different styles of interviewing and what makes for a success and maybe what makes for failure. But if I didn't enjoy it, I wouldn't do it. And I'm sure that's true for you with writing. It's true for me with writing too. Yes. So you've had a splendid and magnificent career, and sometimes all you have to do is say that name, and it still carries the magic. Elizabeth Farnsworth. And I hope you're going to start another novel?
Yes, I think I will.
Can you talk about it?
No, I don't know yet. The image is heavily in my mind. It has to do with the way the moon casts a path across a lake.
So you've got the image again.
Yeah, that's the image, and then there's something that's happening on that path, but I'm not going to tell you what it is yet.
Oh, just a quick question. I don't want you to give away anything. Kansas setting again?
No. This one isn't. This one's Minnesota.
Oh. When were you in Minnesota?
Well, I've spent a lot of time in Minnesota because my grandmother bought a little fisherman's cottage there in 1940, and all the family's gone in the summer. A lot of the family ever since.
So you go up north in the summer?
Yes. Well, my husband and I haven't recently. We were driving always, and when you have to fly, it's not as much fun. But yeah, we did this summer. We stayed at a resort instead of at.
And your husband's an attorney, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So you have an in-house lawyer also?
I do. Yes, like you do. Yeah. I thought, aren't we lucky?
What kind of law did he do?
He was with United Farm Workers for a while. He did a lot of workers' compensation, and he also did Title VII cases.
I was writing about, as you were talking, I was thinking about some of the writing I'm doing now about different people I've interviewed. Some good stories to tell. One of the first interviews I did was with Cesar Chavez, and I was, thrilled to, but I try to emphasize the fact, and maybe this worked for you too, when you're with icons, you have to really be just natural with them, not like, oh, I can't believe I'm interviewing, because that's how I felt. Can't believe I'm interviewing Cesar Chavez. Can't believe I'm interviewing Elizabeth Farnsworth, same type of thing. But I wanted to mention the fact that later on I met some people who were high up in the world of Safeway, the grocer, and they had a very different view of Cesar Chavez than my view, as a young activist politically and so forth. So there's always that to bear in mind, especially. Weren't you looking as an interviewer often for, how do I challenge this person and where do I find the kinds of things that, and it's sometimes can be radioactive,
Yes, but also if you find the right, there's something that can happen with, I was thinking about Renee Fleming. I interviewed Renee Fleming when she was here one year. This was a long time ago, not early in her career. And I remember we were talking about the fact that people that watch opera, how hard it is for opera singers, because many of them have been to this particular opera and heard great singers over many, many years singing it. So they're always comparing. And I said to Renee Fleming, it's kind of like baseball, because my husband and my son, there you watch baseball and they're saying, well, he's just like so-and-so. And she laughed. She thought that was really funny. She said, yeah, come to think of it, it is.
Oh, you hit the right note.
It was fun.
Going over some of these interviews I did, I realized some of the mistakes I've made too, and things that I shouldn't have asked or might not have asked and so forth. So this is where writing can be a really wonderful learning experience. Writing anything, but you've done fiction and nonfiction. Congratulations.
Thank you.
And let me also thank all of you who joined us for this episode of Gray Matter with Michael Krasny, which you can listen to on Apple, Spotify, and on our website at graymatter.show. If you haven't yet become a member of this podcast, I invite you to join by going to the website at graymatter.show, where you can find previous episodes of Gray Matter with Michael Krasny. And again, that's Gray with an E. Also invite you to mail any reactions or suggestions you might have to me at mkrasny@graymatter.show. And thanks to the Gray Matter with Michael Krasny team, Alex, Shannon, Chad, Kevin, Colin, Jeff, Colleen, and Tanya. And a special thanks to this week's guest, Elizabeth Farnsworth. The book again is called Last Light. I'm Michael Krasny.
Bandwidth for Gray Matter is provided by CashFly at CACHEFLY.com.